I moved to Oak Ridge Estates in Columbia, Maryland, because I needed stability. As a community college instructor, I cannot afford complaints or drama that might reach my department chair, and this lakefront community looked perfect on paper. Quiet streets, water views, families who kept to themselves. The homeowners association had a reputation for being strict, but I figured rules were fine as long as they were fair. That illusion lasted exactly 3 weeks. Right up until the morning I stepped outside and found Brenda standing in my driveway with a roll of caution tape in one hand and a clipboard in the other, staring at the orange reflective marker stake I had placed at the edge of my driveway apron the night before. The stake was maybe 2 feet tall, the kind you buy at any hardware store to mark your driveway edge when snow piles up and plows come through. We had gotten 4 inches overnight, and the forecast promised more. I needed the stake so the plow driver I hired privately would not tear up my lawn or clip my mailbox post. Brenda did not see it that way. She told me the stake was an unapproved yard sign, a violation of Oak Ridge community standards, and that I had 24 hours to remove it or face a fine. I asked her to show me where in the covenants it said a driveway marker was a sign. She smiled, tapped her clipboard, and said the board interprets the standards, and the board had decided. That was my introduction to Kimberly Delaney, who went by Brenda and served as the Community Standards Chair, a role she treated like a combination of code enforcement officer and neighborhood prosecutor. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the stake, then a picture of Brenda holding the caution tape. She did not like that. She stepped closer and told me I was making this worse for myself, her voice rising just enough to carry across the quiet street. A neighbor walking his dog glanced over, then kept moving. I told Brenda I would look into the rules and get back to her. Then I went inside and pulled up the Oak Ridge Estates Association covenants on my laptop. I spent an hour reading through every section about exterior modifications, signage, landscaping, and seasonal decorations. There was no mention of driveway markers. There was no mention of stakes. The signage section applied to advertisements, political signs, and business displays. A reflective safety marker was none of those things. I called the management company that Monday morning. The portal was down, so I could not submit a formal dispute online, and the woman on the phone told me she would pass my concern to the board, but that Brenda was the point person for standards issues. I asked if I could get a copy of the meeting minutes where the board discussed driveway markers. She paused, then said she would check, then the call dropped. I called back twice and got voicemail both times. Meanwhile, my heating system started acting up. The furnace was cycling on and off every 10 minutes, and the house temperature was dropping. I had a service call scheduled for that afternoon, and the HVAC tech needed to park in my driveway to unload his equipment. I texted him to confirm, and he said he would be there by 2. At 1:30, I looked out my front window and saw Brenda standing at the curb with another woman I did not recognize, both of them staring at my driveway. The caution tape was now stretched across the end of my driveway in a loose zigzag, tied to my mailbox post on one side and a small decorative boulder on the other. I went outside and asked what she was doing. She told me the driveway was under review and that I should not allow any unauthorized vehicles to park there until the board completed its assessment. I told her I had a heating emergency and a technician coming in 30 minutes. She said that was not her problem, and if the technician parked in the driveway, she would have the vehicle towed for violating the trespass policy. I called the HVAC company and told them to park on the street. The tech arrived, saw the tape, and asked if there was a gas leak or something. I explained it was an HOA thing, and he shook his head and said he had seen worse. He spent 90 minutes diagnosing the furnace, and by the time he left, he had identified a failing blower motor that needed replacement. He said he could come back the next day with the part, but he would need driveway access because the motor was heavy and the path from the street to my side door was covered in ice. I told him I would handle it. That night, I removed the caution tape, folded it neatly, and left it on my front step with a note that said I had a legitimate service need and that I would be happy to discuss the matter at the next board meeting. The next morning, I woke up to a notice taped to my front door. It was printed on Oak Ridge letterhead and said I had missed a mandatory hearing regarding my driveway violation, held the previous evening at 7. I had never been told about a hearing. I had never received a notice, an email, or a phone call. The letter said that because I failed to appear, the board had decided in absentia to impose a $50 fine and require immediate removal of the unapproved stake. It also said that any further violations would result in escalating fines and possible legal action. I took a picture of the notice, then I called the management company again. This time, a different woman answered, and she told me she had no record of a hearing and that the portal was still down so she could not verify anything. She suggested I email Brenda directly. I did not email Brenda. Instead, I drove to the community center where the HOA held its meetings and asked the front desk staff if there had been a hearing the night before. The woman at the desk checked the reservation log and said no. The meeting room had been empty all evening. I asked her to print me a copy of the log for that week, and she did, no questions asked. I took the printout back to my car and sat there for a minute, staring at the empty line for the previous night. Brenda had invented a hearing that never happened, imposed a fine based on that fake hearing, and was now escalating the pressure. I realized this was not about a driveway stake. This was about control, and Brenda was testing how far she could push before I pushed back. That afternoon, the HVAC tech returned with the blower motor. I met him in the driveway and helped him carry the equipment inside. We got the furnace running again, and the house started warming up. As he was packing up his tools, Brenda appeared at my front door, knocking hard enough that I heard it from the basement. I came upstairs and opened the door. She was holding her clipboard again, and she told me she had observed an unauthorized commercial vehicle in my driveway, and that I was now in violation of the guest parking policy. I told her the vehicle belonged to a licensed contractor performing emergency repairs. She said that did not matter, and that the policy required advance written notice for any commercial vehicle. I asked her to show me that policy. She said it was in the operations manual, which was not part of the public covenants. I told her I wanted a copy of the operations manual. She said it was only available to board members. I closed the door and went back to finish paying the tech. He looked at me and said he had been doing HVAC work in Colombia for 15 years, and he had never seen an HOA block a service call. He told me to document everything and consider talking to a lawyer, because this kind of harassment usually got worse before it got better. I thanked him, and after he left, I sat down and started organizing my evidence. I had pictures of the stake, pictures of the caution tape, the fake hearing notice, the community center log, and now a witness who could confirm Brenda had interfered with emergency heating repairs in the middle of winter. I also remembered something that had happened 2 months earlier, before Brenda had fixated on me. A neighbor 3 doors down had called the police because Brenda and another board member had shown up at his house and tried to inspect his backyard without permission, claiming they had received a complaint about an unapproved shed. The neighbor had refused to let them in, and Brenda had threatened to issue a trespass warning against him for blocking HOA business. The police had told her she had no authority to issue a trespass warning on private property, and they had given her a warning about harassment. I had heard about it from another neighbor, but I had not thought much of it at the time. Now I realized that incident had generated a police report, and that report would show a pattern of Brenda abusing her authority. I called the non-emergency line and asked how to get a copy of a police incident report. The dispatcher told me I could request it online with the incident number, and that if I was not directly involved, I might need the homeowner's permission. I decided to visit the neighbor and ask. His name was Marcus, and he was a renter, not an owner, which meant he had no vote in HOA matters but still had to follow the rules. When I knocked on his door and explained why I was there, he invited me in and made coffee. He told me Brenda had been targeting renters for months, trying to pressure landlords to sell by making life miserable for tenants. He said he had filed a complaint with the County Housing Authority about the shed inspection attempt, and he had also contacted a renter advocacy group that helped people fight back against abusive HOAs. He gave me the police incident number, and he also gave me the name of the advocate he had been working with, a woman named Claire who had a background in property law and loved taking on bad HOA boards. Marcus told me to call her, and he said he would back me up if I needed a witness. I called Claire that evening. She answered on the second ring, and I spent 20 minutes walking her through everything that had happened. She asked smart questions, took notes, and then told me 3 things. First, the fake hearing was a major procedural violation, and if I could prove it never happened, the fine was void and Brenda could be removed from the board. Second, the trespass threat against my HVAC tech was likely illegal, because emergency repairs were protected under Maryland housing law and HOA covenants could not override safety codes. Third, I needed to assume Brenda was escalating and that her next move would be more aggressive. Claire told me to keep documenting, to avoid any confrontation that could be twisted against me, and to request a formal hearing with the full board in writing so there would be a paper trail. I sent the email that night, addressed to the management company, and copied to every board member email I could find in the directory. I kept it short and factual. I stated that I disputed the fine, that I had proof the hearing never occurred, and that I requested a formal hearing with the full board to resolve the matter. I attached the community center log and a photo of the stake with a tape measure showing it was a standard driveway marker, not a sign. I also mentioned the HVAC service call and stated that I expected no retaliation for exercising my right to emergency repairs. I hit send and went to bed, hoping that putting everything in writing would force the board to rein Brenda in. Instead, it made things worse. 2 days later, I found a new notice on my door. This one was not about the driveway stake. It was a trespass warning, issued by the Oak Ridge Estates Association Board, informing me that I was prohibited from using the community pool area, the common area docks, and the walking paths around the lake until further notice. The reason given was that I had demonstrated a pattern of non-compliance and confrontational behavior, and that my presence in common areas posed a risk to other residents. The notice was signed by Brenda and countersigned by 2 other board members. It also said that if I violated the trespass warning, the HOA would contact law enforcement and pursue legal action for criminal trespass. I stood on my front step, reading the notice 3 times, my breath fogging in the cold air. The absurdity of it hit me first, and then the danger. The common area docks were part of the reason I had bought into this neighborhood. My property taxes included HOA fees that paid for maintenance of those shared spaces, and now Brenda was unilaterally banning me from using them. But the real problem was the trespass warning itself. If I ignored it and walked down to the lake and Brenda called the police, I could end up with a criminal record, and that could cost me my job. Community colleges run background checks, and any kind of trespass charge, even if I won in court, could trigger a review. I could not risk it. I called Claire again. She told me the trespass warning was almost certainly invalid, because HOA boards cannot ban a homeowner from common areas without a formal hearing and a legitimate safety reason, and non-compliance with a bogus fine did not qualify. She also said that Brenda had just handed me more evidence of abuse of authority. Claire told me to take pictures of the notice, to not set foot in the common areas until we had a legal response in place, and to start looking at the board signatures on the trespass warning. She asked if I recognized the other 2 names. I did not. She told me to find out who they were and whether they actually knew they had signed the notice, because it would not be the first time an HOA officer forged board signatures to make a unilateral decision look official. That possibility had not occurred to me, but once Claire said it, it made perfect sense. Brenda was acting like she had total authority, and the management company was either incompetent or complicit. If she was forging signatures, that was fraud, and it would not just get her removed from the board. It could get her criminally charged. I pulled up the Oak Ridge directory and looked up the 2 names on the trespass warning. One was a man named Greg who lived on the north side of the development, and the other was a woman named Susan who lived near the entrance. I decided to visit them both and ask directly whether they had signed off on banning me from common areas. Greg answered his door in a bathrobe and looked confused when I introduced myself. I showed him the trespass warning and pointed to his name. He squinted at it, then shook his head and said he had never seen that document before. He said Brenda had emailed him 2 weeks earlier, asking for general approval to handle standards enforcement as she saw fit. And he had replied yes, but he had not signed anything specific, and he certainly had not approved banning anyone from the lake. He looked genuinely upset and told me he would email the board and demand an explanation. I thanked him and walked down to Susan's house. She was not home, but her husband answered. And when I showed him the notice, he got angry. He said Susan had resigned from the board 3 months earlier because she did not want to deal with Brenda's drama and that her name should not be on any current HOA documents. He took a picture of the notice with his phone and said he would have Susan contact the management company and possibly a lawyer. I walked back to my house with a knot in my stomach and a growing sense that I had just uncovered something much bigger than a petty dispute over a driveway stake. Brenda had forged board signatures, or at the very least, she had used old approvals and a resigned board member's name to create the appearance of official action. That was fraud. I called Claire and told her what I had found. She told me to get written statements from Greg and Susan confirming they did not approve the trespass warning, and to send those statements to the management company with a demand that the warning be rescinded immediately. She also told me to file a police report for fraud and forgery, because even if the police did not investigate right away, the report would create an official record that I could use later. I spent the rest of the day drafting emails and making calls. Greg sent me a signed statement by that evening, and Susan called me directly and said she was furious that her name had been used after she resigned. She sent me a resignation letter she had submitted to the management company back in September, and she said she would be happy to testify if it came to that. I compiled everything into a single email to the management company, with copies to every board member and Claire. I laid out the evidence, stated that the trespass warning was fraudulent, and demanded an immediate response. I also requested a formal investigation into Brenda's conduct and a full audit of any other documents she had signed on behalf of the board. The management company replied 2 days later with a terse message saying they were reviewing the matter and would respond within 10 business days. That was not good enough. Claire told me to escalate by sending a second email stating that if the fraudulent trespass warning was not rescinded within 48 hours, I would file a complaint with the Maryland Homeowners Association Ombudsman and pursue legal action for defamation and abuse of authority. I sent that email on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Brenda showed up at my door again, this time with a man in a reflective vest who she introduced as a contracted security officer for the HOA. She told me that the board had reviewed my complaint and determined that I was engaging in harassment and intimidation of board members, and that the security officer was there to document my behavior. I looked at the man, who looked uncomfortable, and I asked him if he had been hired by the full board or just by Brenda. He did not answer. I turned back to Brenda and told her I had proof she forged signatures and that I was not going to be intimidated. She smiled, took a step closer, and said I was the only problem on this street, that everyone else followed the rules without drama, and that if I did not start cooperating, things would get much worse. Then she turned and walked away, the security officer following her like a shadow. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Brenda had just told me, in front of a witness, that I was the only problem on the street. That line stuck with me, because it was exactly the kind of thing that would come back to haunt her. I pulled out my phone and texted Claire a summary of what had just happened. She called me immediately and told me that bringing a fake security officer to my door was likely another intimidation tactic, and that I should file a police report for harassment. She also told me something I had not considered. Brenda's escalation meant she was scared, and scared people make mistakes. Claire said the best thing I could do now was stay calm, keep documenting, and let Brenda keep digging her own hole. That night I went through my phone and my email and organized every piece of evidence I had collected. I had photos of the driveway stake, the caution tape in 3 different configurations, the fake hearing notice, the community center log, the trespass warning with the forged signatures, the statements from Greg and Susan, and the police incident number from Marcus's shed inspection fight. I also had the HVAC invoice showing the service call date and time, and a written statement from the tech confirming that Brenda had threatened to tow his vehicle. I created a shared folder and uploaded everything. Then I sent the link to Claire. She told me it was solid, but that we needed one more thing: proof that Brenda had acted without board authority in a situation where she had clear financial or personal motive. That was the kind of evidence that would make the board remove her and possibly trigger a criminal investigation. I did not know what that proof would look like, but I knew where to start looking. The Oak Ridge Estates Association had a community pool that was closed for the winter, but the pool deck and the surrounding common area were still technically accessible. The HOA had installed a gate with a keypad lock, and all residents were supposed to have the code. A few weeks earlier, before the driveway stake incident, I had walked down to the pool area to check out the lake view, and I had noticed that the gate keypad had a small security camera mounted above it. The camera was aimed at the gate, but it also captured a slice of the parking area and the path leading to the docks. If Brenda had been using the pool area for anything shady, or if she had been blocking residents from accessing it without board approval, that camera might have recorded it. The problem was that I was now banned from the common areas, so I could not just walk down and check the camera. I called Marcus and asked if he would be willing to go down to the pool deck and take a look around. He said yes, and he also said he knew how to check if a security camera was actually recording or just a dummy. That afternoon, he texted me a series of photos. The camera was real, and it was connected to a small weatherproof DVR box mounted inside a locked utility panel next to the gate. The panel had a label with the name of the security company that maintained the system, and Marcus had taken a close-up of the label. I looked up the company online and called their customer service line. The woman who answered told me that footage requests had to come from the account holder, which was the Oak Ridge Estates Association, and that she could not release recordings to individual residents. I asked her if the HOA had requested any footage recently. She paused, then said she could not discuss account activity. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Claire and told her about the camera. She told me that if the camera had captured Brenda doing something improper, the footage would be evidence, but that getting access to it would require either a subpoena or cooperation from the management company. She suggested I send another email to the management company specifically requesting that they preserve any security footage from the pool area gate for the past 90 days, and to state that I intended to subpoena the footage if necessary. I sent that email within the hour. The management company did not reply, but the next morning I got a call from a number I did not recognize. It was a woman who introduced herself as a board member I had never heard of, someone named Karen, and she said she wanted to talk to me off the record. She said she had just found out about the forged signatures, and that she was horrified. She told me that Brenda had been running the board like a personal fiefdom for over a year, and that several other board members had either quit or stopped showing up to meetings because they could not deal with her. Karen said she wanted to help, but she was afraid that if she spoke up publicly, Brenda would retaliate against her the same way she was retaliating against me. I told her I understood, but that I needed someone on the board to push for an investigation. Karen said she would try, and she also told me something that made my stomach drop. She said that 2 weeks earlier, Brenda had contacted a towing company and requested that they start patrolling Oak Ridge streets and towing any vehicles that violated guest parking rules. Karen had not been at the meeting where this was discussed, but another board member had told her that Brenda claimed she had full board approval. Karen said she had checked the meeting minutes and there was no record of a vote. She also said the towing company had been given a blanket authorization to tow any vehicle Brenda identified, which meant Brenda could effectively tow anyone she wanted without oversight. Karen told me to be careful, because Brenda had been talking about me specifically and had mentioned wanting to tow my guests to teach me a lesson. I thanked Karen and told her to stay safe, and then I called Claire and told her everything. Claire said the towing company authorization was the smoking gun we needed, because if Brenda had lied about board approval, the towing company would have records showing she was the one who made the request, and that would prove she was acting unilaterally. Claire told me to file a public records request with the management company for all communications between the HOA and the towing company, and to also contact the towing company directly and ask for a copy of their dispatch logs. She said I should frame it as a billing dispute, because towing companies were required to keep records of who authorized each tow, and if I could get those logs, I could prove Brenda had no authority. I spent the next 2 days making calls and sending emails. The towing company was surprisingly cooperative. When I explained that I was a homeowner in Oak Ridge and that I wanted to verify the authorization process for guest parking enforcement, the dispatcher put me through to the operations manager. I told him I was concerned about potential unauthorized tows, and I asked if the HOA had provided written documentation of board approval for the towing contract. He said he would check, and he called me back an hour later. He told me that the contract had been signed by Brenda alone, with no counter-signature, and that the authorization paperwork listed her as the primary contact. He also said that Brenda had called the dispatch line 3 times in the past week to request specific vehicles be towed, but that the drivers had not actually towed anything yet because the vehicles in question were parked legally on the street and there was no clear violation. I asked if he could send me a copy of the dispatch logs, and he hesitated. I told him I was working with an attorney and that we were investigating possible fraud, and that if he did not cooperate voluntarily, we would subpoena the records. He said he would talk to his boss, and he called me back the next morning and said they would send me redacted logs showing the date, time, and nature of each request Brenda had made, but not the personal information of the vehicle owners. I gave him my email, and within an hour I had a PDF in my inbox. I opened it and stared at the screen. Brenda had requested tows for 5 different vehicles over the past 10 days, and 2 of them were my guests. One was the HVAC tech, and the other was a friend who had visited me for dinner 3 days earlier. The logs also showed that Brenda had called the towing company on the same day she had issued the fake trespass warning, which meant she had been planning to tow my guests as part of her escalation strategy. I forwarded the logs to Claire immediately. She called me within minutes and said this was exactly what we needed. She told me she would draft a demand letter to the Oak Ridge Estates Association Board and the management company outlining the evidence of fraud, forgery, unauthorized towing requests, and abuse of authority, and demanding that Brenda be removed from the board and that all fines and penalties against me be rescinded. She also said she would include a threat of legal action if the board did not respond within 7 days, and that she would copy the Maryland Homeowners Association Ombudsman and the county attorney's office. I told her to do it, and I also told her I wanted to confront Brenda directly one more time, because I wanted her to know that I had the evidence before the letter arrived. Claire told me that was a bad idea, because any confrontation could be used against me, but I did not care. I was tired of being pushed around, and I wanted Brenda to see my face when I told her I had the dispatch logs. I decided to wait until the next time she showed up at my house, but I did not have to wait long. 2 days later, on a gray Saturday morning with fresh snow falling, Brenda appeared at my front door with the yellow caution tape again, this time with a man in a tow truck idling at the curb. She knocked, and when I opened the door, she told me that my car was parked improperly in my own driveway and that it was creating a safety hazard. I looked past her at my car, which was parked exactly where it had been for weeks, and I told her she was making things up. She smiled and said that the tow truck driver had been authorized by the board to remove the vehicle, and that if I did not move it immediately, it would be towed at my expense. I told her the board had not authorized anything, and that I had proof. She laughed and said I was bluffing. I pulled out my phone, opened the dispatch log PDF, and held it up so she could see the screen. I told her I had the towing company's records showing every request she had made, and that none of them had board approval. I also told her I had statements from Greg and Susan proving she forged their signatures, and that I had an attorney ready to file a lawsuit. Her smile disappeared. She took a step back, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked genuinely rattled. She told me I was making this worse for myself, the same line she had used before, but this time her voice was shaky. I told her the only person making things worse was her, and that she had just tried to tow my car with a driver waiting at the curb, which was going to look great in front of a judge. She turned and walked quickly to the tow truck, said something to the driver, and then got in her own car and drove away. The tow truck driver sat there for a minute, then he got out and walked up to my door. He told me he had been hired to do a job, but that after hearing what I said, he wanted nothing to do with it. He said he would call his dispatcher and cancel the order, and he also said he would be happy to provide a statement if I needed one. I thanked him, got his contact information, and watched him drive away. That afternoon, Claire sent the demand letter. It was 10 pages long, with exhibits that included the forged trespass warning, the dispatch logs, the statements from Greg and Susan, the community center log, the police incident number from Marcus's case, and the HVAC tech's statement. The letter demanded that Brenda be removed from the board immediately, that all fines and penalties against me be rescinded, that the trespass warning be withdrawn, and that the HOA issue a formal apology. It also demanded that the board conduct a full audit of all documents Brenda had signed, and that the management company terminate its relationship with her. The letter gave the board 7 days to respond, and it stated that if they did not comply, I would file a lawsuit for fraud, defamation, harassment, and abuse of authority. The management company responded in 4 days. The email was brief and corporate, but the message was clear. The board had voted to place Brenda on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation, and the trespass warning had been rescinded. The email also said that the $50 fine had been voided, and that the board would be conducting an internal review of all standards enforcement actions taken over the past year. It did not mention an apology, and it did not say whether Brenda would be removed permanently, but it was a start. Claire told me to accept it as a win, and to wait and see what the investigation turned up, because if the board found more evidence of misconduct, they would have no choice but to remove her. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, I heard from several other Oak Ridge residents who had been targeted by Brenda. One couple had been fined for an unapproved mailbox color that turned out to be the exact color specified in the covenants. Another family had been threatened with a lien over a fence that Brenda claimed was 6 inches too tall, even though the survey showed it was compliant. A retired veteran had been banned from flying an American flag on a standard flagpole because Brenda said it was not a holiday, and holiday flags were the only ones allowed. Every one of these people had evidence, and every one of them was willing to go on record. Claire compiled their statements and sent them to the board as supplemental evidence, and she also forwarded everything to the Maryland Homeowners Association ombudsman. The final confrontation happened at the tow truck staging area near the community entrance, a small gravel lot where the HOA kept maintenance equipment and where the towing company sometimes parked when waiting for a dispatch. I had gone there to meet with the tow truck driver who had been at my house because he had agreed to give me a signed statement about Brenda's unauthorized tow request. When I pulled up, Brenda was already there, standing next to her car and talking on her phone. She saw me, ended her call, and walked over. She looked furious. She told me I had destroyed her reputation, that I had turned the entire neighborhood against her, and that she would make sure I regretted it. I told her I had not destroyed anything. I told her she had done this to herself by lying, forging signatures, and harassing residents. I told her I had timestamps, dispatch logs, police reports, and witness statements, and that every piece of evidence pointed straight to her. She stepped closer, her face red, and said I was the only problem on this street, that everyone else had been fine until I showed up. I remembered that line from weeks earlier, and I smiled. I told her that was interesting, because I had statements from 6 other residents who said she had targeted them too, and that her claim about me being the only problem was going to be Exhibit A in the lawsuit if she did not back off. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the tow truck driver walked over and handed me the signed statement. He looked at Brenda and told her he would not be taking any more calls from the HOA and that his company was terminating the contract because they did not do business with people who lied about authorization. Brenda stared at him, then at me, and then she got in her car and drove away without another word. I stood there in the cold, watching her taillights disappear, and I felt the tension drain out of my shoulders. It was over. The board held an emergency meeting a week later. Claire attended as my representative, and she presented the full evidence package. The board voted unanimously to remove Brenda from her position as Community Standards Chair, and they also voted to refer the matter to the county prosecutor for possible criminal charges related to forgery and fraud. The management company issued a formal apology to me and to the other residents Brenda had targeted, and they refunded all fines that had been issued under her authority. The board also voted to adopt new rules requiring that all enforcement actions be approved by at least 2 board members, and that all trespass warnings and towing requests go through the management company with documented board approval. A month later, I received a check in the mail for $200, covering the voided fine and reimbursing me for the attorney consultation fees. The check came with a letter from the new board president, thanking me for bringing the misconduct to their attention and promising that Oak Ridge would be run transparently and fairly going forward. I deposited the check, and then I walked down to the lake for the first time since the trespass warning had been issued. The ice was starting to break up, and the docks were wet and slippery, but the view was exactly as good as I remembered. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cold air and watching the water, and I thought about how close I had come to losing my home and my job over a driveway stake. Marcus joined me after a few minutes, and we stood side by side in silence. He told me that Claire was helping him file a formal complaint against the HOA for the shed inspection incident, and that other renters in the neighborhood were coming forward with their own stories. He said the board was talking about creating a renter liaison position to make sure tenants had a voice in HOA decisions, and that the whole culture of Oak Ridge was starting to shift. I told him I was glad, and that none of it would have happened if he had not been willing to share his police report and connect me with Claire. He shrugged and said that was what neighbors were supposed to do. The orange driveway stake was still in my driveway when I got home that afternoon, right where I had left it. I had thought about removing it once the dispute was over, but I decided to keep it there as a reminder. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I saw that little reflective marker, and I remembered that sometimes the smallest things can become the biggest fights, and that standing up to bullies is exhausting and scary. But it is also the only way to stop them. Brenda never contacted me again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved out of Oak Ridge a few months later and that she sold her house quietly without listing it publicly. I do not know where she went, and I do not care. What mattered was that the HOA was no longer her personal weapon, and that the rest of us could live in peace. The winter ended, and spring came, and life in Oak Ridge went back to normal. I kept teaching at the community college, and I kept my head down and stayed out of HOA politics. But I also stayed in touch with Claire and Marcus, and when other residents reached out to me for advice about HOA disputes, I helped them the same way Marcus had helped me. I learned that most HOA horror stories end badly because people do not know their rights and they do not have evidence. But that when you do your homework and you stand your ground, even the worst HOA tyrant can be stopped. The dispatch logs, the forged signatures, the witness statements, the police reports, those were the things that mattered. Not anger, not confrontation, not trying to out-yell someone at a meeting, just cold, hard evidence and the willingness to use it. I let Brenda get the last word that day at the tow truck staging area because I wanted the last consequence, and in the end I got it. She lost her position, her reputation, and her home, and I got to keep mine. The caution tape she had used to block my driveway ended up in a box in my basement, a weird souvenir of the strangest fight I ever had. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, and I remember how close I came to backing down and how glad I am that I did not. Because the only thing worse than fighting a bad HOA is living under one and pretending everything is fine. And I was not willing to do that. Not then. Not ever.